On a February morning in 1985, Clem Hadley opened the door to his machine shed and stood there for a long time without moving. The spot where the 560 usually sat was empty. The oil stain on the concrete was still dark and fresh enough that the winter cold hadn't pulled the smell out of it yet. Over on the wall, the heavy chains were still swaying just slightly on their hook, looking like something had brushed them on the way out. He didn't yell or pick up the phone to call the sheriff. He didn't even drive over to his brother's place to demand an explanation. He just stood there in the cold. This is a story about a tractor, but it is really a story about what happens when a man's brother crosses a line that can never be uncrossed. It is about what it costs both of them when the man who was wronged chooses to keep his mouth shut instead of picking a fight. Their father, Earl Hadley, bought that 560 brand new back in 1958. He paid cash for it at the International Harvester dealer in Decorah, which was the only way Earl ever bought anything in his life. There was no loan and no installment plan involved. Because Earl had the money, he wrote the check and then he drove the machine home. It was a diesel with the 6-cylinder D282 engine that put out 72 horsepower. It featured the torque amplifier transmission that let you drop into a lower gear ratio without stopping, so you could just pull the lever and feel the machine dig in deeper. At idle, it made a low rhythmic rumble that you could hear from the far end of a field. But under a heavy load, it opened up into a pulsing chug that you felt through the seat more than you heard with your ears. Earl ran that machine for 25 years without ever taking a single loan out against it. You need to understand that before anything else, because it matters. In a county full of men who financed every piece of equipment on 5-year notes, Earl Hadley owned his outright from the very first day. The 560 was proof of something, and it wasn't about wealth because Earl wasn't a rich man. It was proof that a person could build something real without owing the bank a piece of his soul. His boys grew up with that machine, the way farm kids always do, by sitting on the fender and fetching tools and learning to read the color of the exhaust. Clem was the one who really took to it. He learned to feel the TA engage through the seat before he even understood what the lever was doing mechanically. He knew the sound of the engine when it was happy, and the sound of it when it was working too hard. And by the time he was 17, he could tell you which one he was hearing without even looking at the tachometer. Harlan learned it too, but he saw it differently. Harlan focused on the limits of the machine and what it couldn't do. He looked at how many acres it could cover in a day and where that number fell short. And to be fair, he wasn't wrong about any of that. The 560 was a strong tractor for its time, but by the early 1970s, there were bigger and faster machines that could work twice the ground before the sun went down. Harlan wanted one of those new machines. Clem never did because the 560 was plenty for what they had. And everything they had was owned free and clear. That combination of having enough machine and no debt felt like the right way to farm, and it felt like their father's way. That was the first real disagreement between them, even if nobody was calling it that yet. They were still just two brothers with different opinions about horsepower, and the fracture was so thin in those early years that you couldn't have slid a piece of paper into the crack. Then, their father died in the winter of 1971, and the farm passed to both of them equally. That sounds like a fair deal, until it isn't. On a Tuesday morning in 1971, the United States Secretary of Agriculture, a man named Earl Butz, gave every farmer in the Midwest a simple choice: get big or get out. Butts took a hammer to the old New Deal programs that had kept the grain supply steady and the prices predictable for decades. He told every man with a tractor to plant from fence row to fence row, to borrow against the dirt they stood on, and to expand while the money was cheap. The future belonged to the large and the leveraged, he said, and the small operator was nothing but a relic of a slower time. Efficiency meant scale, and scale meant debt. And in this new era, debt was just the cost of doing business. A lot of men believed him, and you have to understand why, because the message came with plenty of evidence. In 1972, the United States brokered a massive grain deal with the Soviet Union that moved over $1 billion worth of wheat and corn in just a few months. Grain prices jumped to levels most Iowa farmers had never seen in their entire working lives, and land values followed right behind them. A man who had bought ground for $300 an acre in 1965 was watching it appraise for 5 times that by 1974. On paper, everyone with a deed was getting rich, and the math said to borrow more and plant more, because the rising value of the land would always cover what you owed. Harlan read all of that as confirmation of everything he wanted to believe. He went to the bank in the spring of 1973 and borrowed against the land they'd inherited from their father to buy a brand new IH-1066. It was 100 horsepower of big iron, exactly what he'd wanted for years. And he followed that up by leasing more acres from a neighbor who was ready to quit. Then he bought a bigger planter to match the tractor, and each decision followed logically from the one before it, which is how debt works when everything is still going up. The loan on the 1066 was secured by land worth more than the note, and the lease payments came out of corn receipts that were higher than they'd ever been. On paper, Harlan wasn't being reckless, he was being ambitious. And there's a difference, until there isn't. Clem watched all of it and said almost nothing. He'd read the same news about the Soviet grain deal and seen the same price boards at the elevator, but he'd come to a very different conclusion. To Clem, a spike in corn prices because the Soviets had a bad harvest wasn't a new economic reality. It was just a weather event with a price tag attached. The land values made even less sense to him because ground doesn't get more productive just because a banker says it's worth more. The dirt is the same dirt it was 40 years ago, and while the number on a piece of paper might change, paper is something that burns. So Clem kept farming the original ground and kept running the 560 while planting only what he could pay for out of last year's receipts. When Harlan talked about his new credit line at Christmas dinner in 1974, Clem ate his pie and didn't say much of anything. He wasn't sulking or being difficult. He just didn't see the point of an argument that the next 10 years would settle one way or another. Through the late 1970s, Harlan's bet looked like a stroke of genius. His operation was 3 times the size of Clem's. His equipment was newer, and his yields were bigger in raw numbers. At the grain elevator and the implement dealer, Harlan was the kind of farmer people pointed to as a success story. He'd done exactly what Butts said to do, and for a long time, the numbers said he was right. Clem was the quiet one, the small one who still drove the old red 560 and went home before dark. The thing about a bet that's working is that it starts to feel like skill. Harlan had borrowed through the 1970s and watched his land appreciate and his yields climb. And by 1979, he'd stopped thinking of any of it as a risk. It was just farming, the modern way it was done now, and he felt the men who stayed small weren't being careful so much as they were being left behind. Then Paul Volcker got to work. Volcker was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and in 1979, he decided that inflation was the country's real enemy, and the only way to kill it was to make borrowing expensive. He pushed interest rates up past 15% and then past 18, which was painful for a family buying a house, but a total disaster for a farmer. For a man carrying variable rate loans against land that had already been pledged as collateral, those numbers were a death sentence. Harlan's monthly interest charges didn't just go up, they started to compound. The loan on the 1066 and the line of credit on the operating expenses each recalculated upward by a massive amount, and he'd been managing payments on the assumption that rates would stay low. That assumption was now wrong in a way that couldn't be fixed with a good corn harvest, no matter how hard he worked. Then the land values moved, and they didn't slide gently. They fell the way things fall when too many people are selling at once and nobody with good credit is left to buy. The ground Harlan had borrowed against, the very dirt whose rising value had justified every loan he'd taken, started coming in at appraisals below what he actually owed on it. The math that had made him look like a genius in 1977 was running in reverse by 1981, and it was running faster every single day. His first move was to plant more, because the instinct is always to push yield up and cover the gap with volume. He put in longer days and pushed the 1066 harder to squeeze more acres into the rotation. But it didn't help. Corn prices were dropping too because every over-leveraged farmer in the Midwest had the same instinct, and the elevator wasn't going to pay a premium for a surplus. You can't outrun a market by feeding it more of what it doesn't want. Clem watched from across the township line. His own operation hadn't grown, which meant it also hadn't borrowed any money it didn't have. He had the same ground and the same 560 working the rows it had always worked, and when interest hit 18%, his cost structure didn't change because he had no variable rate debt. When corn prices dropped, his margins got tighter, but tight was something he knew how to manage. He built his whole life around it. What he noticed was Harlan's machinery sitting idle in the middle of the day. He saw a planter left in the field past the window when it should have been running, and the 1066 parked near the road with dried mud still on the tires. When equipment sits like that in the middle of planting season, it means the man who owns it is spending his hours somewhere else. Usually, that somewhere involves bankers and paperwork and conversations he doesn't want to have. In the spring of 1982, Harlan missed a loan payment and the bank sent a letter. It was politely worded the way bank letters always are before they stop being polite, and Harlan read it at the kitchen table before putting it in a drawer. He didn't tell anyone, not even Clem. That was the moment the fracture stopped being thin, though he didn't know it yet. He thought he was managing a temporary problem that next year's crop or a land sale would cover. He thought he still had options. But by 1984, Harlan wasn't farming anymore. He was just managing debt. And debt is something that eventually manages you. The letter that arrived in January of 1985 wasn't written to be polite. Harlan had already burned through the grace period the bank gave him back in 1982, and he'd used up the restructured note from 1983, and even the extended terms they'd handed him in the spring of 1984 were gone. The men at the bank had been patient, in that slow way institutions are patient when they think a problem might just fix itself. But by January of 1985, they'd stopped believing in miracles. The letter named a specific figure, and it named a deadline of 30 days. It told him exactly what happened after those 30 days were up, which was the start of foreclosure proceedings on every acre of land he had left. Harlan sat at his kitchen table for a long time with that letter sitting right in front of him. He started going through his assets the way a man goes through his pockets when he knows his wallet is gone but keeps trekking anyway, hoping he missed something. The 1066 was already pledged as collateral because the bank held a security interest in it, and that meant it wasn't really his to sell, even if he could find a buyer with cash. The land he still held was underwater, and appraised at less than what he owed against it, and his operating account only had enough to run the farm through spring if things went perfectly, which they never did. What he had, free and clear with no lien on it, was his half of the 560. The machine sat in Clem's shed on ground they still technically shared through the original inheritance they'd received from their father. Clem had been the one doing the work of maintaining it and running it, and he was the one who kept oil in the crankcase and the battery charged through the long winters. But the tractor had come to both of them from their father, and since Harlan's name was on the same deed, he had a legal claim on it. He told himself that more than once to make it feel right. He found a buyer through a neighbor who ran equipment trades out of his barn the way some men run a side business in parts. Which is to say, he did it quietly, by word of mouth, for cash only. The buyer lived 2 counties north and was looking for a working 560 at a fair price, and the neighbor brokered the whole thing in a single phone call. There was no auction and no public listing because that was just how things moved in 1985, before the internet made everything a matter of public record. A machine could leave a shed and be in another county before anyone even knew to look for it. The buyer showed up on a Tuesday morning with a flatbed truck and a driver. Harlan met them at the shed and unlocked the door himself. Then, he walked over to the machine and ran his hand along the hood one time before stepping back. The driver got it started, and the diesel caught on the second crank, filling the shed with that low rumble that always felt like a heartbeat. The chains on the wall hook swayed when the door opened wide, and Harlan watched the flatbed pull down the road and told himself he'd call Clem that evening to explain. He didn't make the call that evening. He told himself he'd do it in the morning, once he'd figured out the right way to start the conversation. But morning came and he still didn't pick up the phone. He deposited the cash and wired the money to the bank, and just like that, the foreclosure clock stopped ticking. He'd bought himself some time and kept telling himself he'd explain it all later, and he convinced himself there was a version of this story that Clem would understand, because brothers are supposed to work through hard things. Later never came. The shed was cold when Clem opened it that afternoon. It was that February kind of cold that settles deep into the concrete floor and stays there no matter what the sun is doing. The oil stain on the floor was still dark and smelled faintly warm compared to the frozen air outside. And the chains on the wall hook were still moving just a little bit, the way they move when something large has recently passed under them. The space where the 560 had sat for 27 years was just empty. It wasn't broken or damaged, it was just gone. And it was gone the way a thing is gone when someone makes a decision and carries it out and leaves before you get home. Clem stood in the doorway. He didn't go inside the shed. He just stood there and looked at the shape of what used to be there, and he understood everything. Clem closed the shed door and went inside his house and made supper. That's the part people don't expect when they hear this story. There was no angry phone call and no truck pulling into Harlan's driveway, and there was definitely no confrontation at the door in the February dark. He just heated up what was in the pot and ate at the kitchen table before washing his dish and going to bed. If you'd driven past the farmhouse that night, you'd have seen one lamp in the window and smoke coming from the chimney, and you wouldn't have thought a thing of it. He didn't call the next morning either. He went out and fed the cattle and broke the ice on the water tank, and then he checked on a heifer that had been acting off her feed. The work that needed doing got done because that's what a farmer does, and the day passed the way days do when a man decides to let something settle before he decides what it means. By the third day, he knew exactly what it meant. He'd known from that first evening, really, but 3 days gave him the time he needed to make sure he wasn't missing something. He considered whether there was any version of this where Harlan had tried to reach him or left a message he'd missed, but there wasn't. The shed door had been locked when he left that morning, and it was unlocked when he got home. And since Harlan had a key, there was only one way to read the situation. Harlan drove past the farm on the second day. Clem saw the truck from the barn and watched his brother slow down on the road, but Harlan kept going when he saw the light was on in the house. He didn't pull in, and he didn't stop, and that told Clem everything he needed to know. A man who was going to explain himself would have stopped, but a man who is still working out a lie drives past and tells himself he'll come back tomorrow. He didn't come back tomorrow. They finally saw each other about 2 weeks later at Gene Prouty's farm. A few men had gathered there to help move some equipment out of a shed that had collapsed after an ice storm came through. Clem was there because Gene had helped him pull a stuck wagon out of a ditch 3 years back. And that's just how the world worked back then. You showed up when a neighbor needed hands without being asked. And Harlan showed up for the same reason, which meant they were both standing in the same yard on a Thursday morning. Harlan started walking toward him. Clem watched him come the way you watch weather move across a field, with no alarm and no change in his face, just quiet attention. Harlan opened his mouth to speak, and Clem looked at him once, a long, steady look that said everything a man could say without using a single word. And then he turned back to the work. He picked up the come-along and set the hook and went back to pulling. Harlan didn't finish whatever sentence he'd started. He went to the other side of the shed and worked the rest of the morning without saying a word to anyone. That was it. That was the whole confrontation. People who've never lived in a place like this might think it was just avoidance, but it wasn't. It was a verdict. Clem had considered the matter for 2 weeks and come to a final conclusion, and that look he gave his brother was the sentence being handed down. There was no appeal and no scheduled review, and while it wasn't meant to be cruel, it was a permanent reckoning with what Harlan was and what they were to each other from that day forward. Harlan got his restructuring in the end. The bank reworked the note and took the land that was underwater, but they let him keep the house and a small parcel of ground. He survived the way a man survives when everything he built gets taken back, which is to say he had less than he started with and a long time to think about why. The version of Harlan who'd believed in the boom and talked big at the co-op was gone. What was left of the man went home and lived quietly, and never once brought up the 560. Neither did Clem. By the time the spring of 1985 rolled around, Clem was in a tough spot because he needed a tractor to get his seeds in the ground. He had a neighbor named Dale Bush, who lived 2 miles east and farmed 120 acres of his own. Dale kept an old Farmall M in the back of his machine shed, but he only used it for light loader work or the occasional tractor pull on the weekends. News travels fast in a small town without anyone ever having to say a word out loud, and Dale had heard through the grapevine that Clem was trying to farm without his main machine. On a Saturday morning in April, Dale drove over and knocked on the door to tell Clem the M was his to use for the whole planting season. There was no talk of money or paperwork, because it was just a simple understanding between 2 men who had known each other since they were kids in grade school. Clem spent the months of May and June sitting on that Farmall M while he worked his fields. It was a lot slower than his old 560, and it didn't have the same weight behind it, but the engine ran smooth, and he knew he could fix it himself if something broke. Having a machine you can actually repair is the only thing that matters when the weather is right for planting. And while it wasn't his best crop ever, he got the seeds in the dirt. Sometimes in this business, just getting the job done is the whole game. While he was out there planting, he was also keeping his eyes open for a permanent solution. He started putting the word out through those same quiet channels that had carried his original 560 away on that flatbed truck. He told people he was looking for another one, but he didn't want a new machine or anything that came with a bank loan attached to the title. He wanted a 560 specifically because he understood the tolerances of that machine like a road he could drive in the dark. He knew exactly where those tractors were strong and where they were likely to fail, which meant he knew which ones were worth the money and which ones he should walk away from. The phone finally rang in August when a man from Alamaki County called about a tractor sitting in a shed. The previous owner had lost everything in a foreclosure the winter before, and the machine had ended up with a nephew who didn't know the first thing about farming and had no interest in learning. That nephew just wanted the tractor gone so he could have his floor space back, and he set an asking price that made his intentions very clear. On a Wednesday morning, Clem drove up to the northern part of the county to see if the machine was worth saving. The tractor was in rough shape when he found it. Most of the red paint had faded off the hood, and the rear tires were so worn down that you could see the white fabric weave showing through the rubber. When he started it up, the transmission showed that specific grinding hesitation that every old-timer recognized as a failing torque amplifier. That was the weak point in the final drive that plagued the early production units, and while the company eventually fixed it in later models, they never really admitted there was a problem. Most buyers would have turned around and left right then, but Clem saw that mechanical failure as a reason to lower the price. He knew what caused the grinding, and he knew he could fix it himself in a cold shed over the winter months. He counted out the cash for the nephew and had the tractor back on his own property by Friday afternoon. The rebuild started in October and stretched all the way through the end of February. He had to source special cylinder sleeves and piston pins because the early D282 engines used a smaller diameter pin that wasn't kept on the shelves at the local parts counter. He worked from a service manual he'd bought back in 1962 for $3, and the pages were stiff with old oil and the winter chill. He followed those instructions the way a master carpenter follows a set of blueprints, moving methodically and never skipping a single step because he trusted the men who wrote the book. The torque amplifier finally came apart on a Tuesday afternoon in December when the temperature outside had dropped to 11 degrees. Even with the propane heater humming in the corner, the shed was barely 30 degrees. But he didn't seem to mind the cold. He laid the planetary gears out on a clean piece of cardboard and checked every single part under the shop light, measuring the clearances with a feeler gauge he had inherited from his father. Every hour he spent in that shed was a choice he made to keep his life moving forward. It wasn't a loud or dramatic choice, but rather the quiet decision to set the next part down and pick up the next tool until the job was finished. By the time February rolled around, the engine fired up on the very first crank. The deep rumble of that diesel engine filled the shed, and for the first time in a long time, things felt right again. The two brothers continued to see each other at family events for many years after the tractor was taken. They sat at the same table for Christmas dinner at their mother's house until she passed away in 1989, and they saw each other at weddings and funerals after that. At a neighbor's retirement party in 1991, they stood near each other and talked about the weather without any visible signs of trouble. If you were a stranger watching them from across the room, you probably would have thought they were a perfectly normal, close-knit family. That polite behavior was actually worse than if they had been shouting at each other. Anger has a shape you can deal with, but being cordial is just a thin layer of ice over a very deep hole. Both men knew exactly what was sitting under the surface of their conversations, but neither one of them was willing to break the ice and talk about it. Harlan never once said he was sorry for what happened. It wasn't because he didn't realize he'd messed up, because he knew exactly what his choices had cost his brother. The problem was that a real apology requires you to name the sin, and naming it meant admitting to 10 years of lies and hidden letters. He would have had to explain the loans he took out in secret and the missed payments he tried to hide so he wouldn't look like a failure. The apology he owed Clem wasn't just a quick sentence. It was a decade worth of explanations, and Harlan could never figure out how to start that conversation. Clem never asked for an explanation either. He was a quiet man who understood the way the world worked, and he knew that you can't talk a tractor back onto a farm once it's been sold. If he forced Harlan to apologize, it wouldn't have fixed the past or brought back the years of stress and hard labor. An apology would have made Harlan feel better, but Clem had no interest in making life easier for the man who had put his livelihood at risk. The cost of that silence was something Clem felt every single day he went out to work the land. He lost a brother who knew the history of every rock outcropping in the East Field and remembered which cows had the best calves 30 years ago. That kind of shared knowledge only grows when two people work the same dirt for a lifetime. And once it's gone, you can't just go out and buy it from someone else. Clem felt that empty space for the rest of his life, but he didn't let himself get bitter about it. What he bought with that silence was a different kind of freedom. The farm was finally his and his alone, and he worked it on his own terms, without ever having to worry about a bank or a brother. The 560 he rebuilt in the shed actually ran better than the original one because he had used better parts and set the tolerances himself. His farm didn't get any bigger after 1985, but it didn't need to grow to be successful. It provided exactly what he needed and stayed small enough that he could manage it by himself, which meant it was something he could actually protect. He had spent his later years building a life on ground that no one could ever take away from him again. In his mind, that had to count for something, and as he looked out over his fields, he decided it was enough. This story isn't really about a tractor, or the farm crisis, or even two brothers who stopped speaking to each other. It is about two different answers to the same hard question. That question was how much a man should risk with what he didn't build himself. Harlan's answer was to treat inherited ground like collateral, and he leveraged his father's equity against a bet on the future because he trusted that rising numbers would stay up forever. Clem's answer was to treat that same ground as a responsibility, so he kept it inside what he could own and fix and pay for himself. He understood that being small and survivable beats being large and exposed every single time the weather turns. The old saying to get big or get out didn't just bankrupt the farms in this country. It dissolved partnerships that had been built on handshakes and decades of trust, and it turned a shared inheritance into a transaction one brother made without telling the other. That is the part you won't find in the economic history books, but the human wreckage was restructured right along with the debt. If you have ever been the one who held the line while someone else gambled with your shared resources, you already know how Clem's silence felt. It wasn't righteous or even satisfying to him, but it was necessary. The 560 he rebuilt wasn't the same machine his father drove off the lot in 1958. It had different sleeves and different pins, and the transmission was rebuilt from a manual older than some of the men listening to this story. But the tractor still ran the same ground, and it made that same deep rumble at idle. For Clem, that had to be enough. On winter evenings, after the cattle were fed, Clem sometimes ran the rebuilt 560 just to hear the engine. The diesel sound filled the shed the way it always had, and it was steady, low, and unhurried. Was Harlan wrong to do what he did? Or was he only wrong to do it without asking his brother first? That question doesn't have a clean answer, and maybe that is the whole point of the story. If you believe The Quiet Ones are worth watching, subscribe to the channel. They don't make much noise, but they don't disappear either.